The boardroom was colder than usual, and not just because of the air conditioning that always hummed too loud above the ceiling tiles. I had walked in expecting another quarterly review, another slow dance of charts, projections, and cautious optimism. What I didn't expect was the folder already sitting at the head of the table, thick cream paper, and my name typed across it in sharp black ink. The new CEO didn't even look up when I pulled out my chair. She slid the folder toward me with 2 fingers, like it was a check at a diner. Her nails were painted the kind of red that meant blood had already been spilled. "Your time has passed," she said, flat and cold. Not a greeting, not an explanation. Just a scalpel across my throat in 7 syllables. She was 25, barely older than some of the interns we used to chew through like kindling. Fresh face, sharp jawline, the kind of confidence that comes from never having been cut down before. I stared at the folder for a long moment before I touched it. My hand didn't shake. "My name is Martin Kane. I'm 43 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was Executive Vice President of Global Strategies at Halloway & Pierce. 19 years. Almost 2 decades of waking before dawn, boarding planes that never landed where I wanted, shaking hands that still had blood under the nails. Deals worth billions passed through my fingers, and I closed them with precision most surgeons envy. And now, according to her, I was obsolete. She leaned back in her chair, eyes already scanning her tablet, dismissing me like a servant who had lingered too long. "This company needs younger blood. We're pivoting, Martin. You're a legacy player, and legacies slow us down." Her voice was steady, not cruel, not warm, just deliberate. Each word a pin hammered into the coffin she believed I'd climb into quietly. I smiled. That was the first mistake she didn't see. Smiling is silence's camouflage. I've used it across tables from cartel financiers, hostile ministers, men who'd have happily slit my throat if they thought it gave them an advantage. Smiling tells them you've surrendered, when in fact, you've already mapped their exit routes and mined half of them. I didn't argue. Didn't remind her that without me, Halloway & Pierce would have collapsed in 2009. Didn't mention the shell networks I built in Singapore, the private supply chain I leveraged during the oil crisis, or the blackout deals that made governments whisper our name with grudging respect. I just closed the folder, rose from my chair, and extended my hand. "Congratulations," I said evenly. "I'm sure you'll do great things." She shook my hand without looking up. That was her second mistake. Eyes matter. A predator always knows when it's safe to look away. She thought I was prey. The board members kept their eyes down, complicit in their silence. They had signed their names to this purge, chasing youth and image like stock prices. They thought she was the future. I let them think it. I let them all believe they had buried me. When I stepped into the hallway, I set the folder on the marble credenza beneath the portrait of Halloway himself, the founder who once told me in private that loyalty mattered more than speed. I wondered what he'd say if he saw this girl in his chair, writing epitaphs for men who built the very walls around her. I walked out of the tower, into the sharp noon sunlight. To the passers-by on the street, I probably looked like any other executive, carrying the weight of a layoff, another casualty of corporate spring cleaning. But inside, something old was moving again, something I'd locked away when I decided to trade blood for contracts, war rooms for boardrooms. The truth is, I was never just an executive. I was the architect behind the curtain, the man who made governments bend and rivals vanish. The deals I closed weren't just about numbers. They were arteries feeding the global machine. I knew which countries would starve without us, which markets would collapse if I so much as tugged a thread. My position wasn't a title. It was leverage, and leverage doesn't retire. I lit a cigarette I hadn't touched in years and drew the smoke deep, letting the fire steady my pulse. I thought about her words, about the casual dismissal, the arrogance of youth that mistakes ambition for invincibility. She believed she'd cut me loose. She believed she'd won. She thought she'd fired me. What she'd really done was unlock a vault I swore I'd never open again. The city looked different when you walked through it carrying silence instead of rage. I kept my pace steady, my face neutral, another suit swallowed by the crowd. But underneath, every step felt like a fuse inching toward powder. I didn't go home. Home was for men who still had something to lose. I drove instead to the old loft on the East End, the one no one knew about, the one I paid for through a holding company buried 5 shells deep. To the outside world, it looked like an abandoned workspace, brick walls, peeling paint, a single bulb in the stairwell. But behind the steel-reinforced door was something else entirely. The air hit me like a vault when I pushed inside. Stale, metallic, the smell of machines that had been sleeping too long. I dropped my jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and walked past the front room into the real heart of it. Against the walls stood 6 terminals, triple encrypted, each tethered to offshore servers that could vanish with a keystroke. Stacks of binders, coded by color, lined the shelves. A safe sat beneath the desk, floor-bolted, loaded not with cash, but with passwords, passphrases, and keys to doors most people didn't know existed. I hadn't powered any of it on in nearly 4 years. I told myself I'd retired this side of me, buried it when I chose boardrooms over war rooms. But that afternoon, after 19 years of loyalty, erased with a single folder and a single sentence, I knew the lock had come off. My hands moved from memory. Flip the main breaker, wait for the hum, boot sequence hidden beneath the desktop wallpaper of a weather app. Screens flickered to life one by one, filling the room with pale light until it looked less like a loft and more like a command center. As the machines warmed, old ghosts stirred. I remembered Berlin, 2012, when a handshake I orchestrated kept a German conglomerate alive and left 3 rivals gutted within a quarter. I remembered Dubai, 2015, when I turned an oil glut into leverage so precise it toppled a minister without spilling a drop of blood. Billion-dollar deals don't close with charm. They close with pressure. You find the one vein no one dares expose, and you squeeze until the pulse is yours to command. I did that for almost 2 decades, and the company fed on it like oxygen. They called me a strategist. What I really was, what I still am, is an executioner who wears a tie instead of a uniform. The main terminal finished sinking, and I leaned in, pulling up the network traces I'd seeded years ago. They were meant as insurance, a way to track movements not just of money, but of intent. Every digital transaction leaves fingerprints, even when scrubbed. It just takes the right light to reveal them. I entered a few commands, followed the trail of the new CEO's early moves, the partnerships she'd announced with fanfare, the private investors she praised in press releases. On the surface, everything looked clean, but surfaces are for amateurs. I pushed deeper, cross-referencing shell accounts, mapping the flow of funds through offshore nodes. The pattern emerged fast, too fast. These weren't her choices. She was no prodigy building her empire overnight. She was a puppet, and her strings led overseas. The capital injections didn't come from the polished venture group she bragged about in interviews. They came from shadow banks tied to a name I hadn't heard in years. The Valdez Syndicate. Cartel money, laundered through legitimate fronts, poured into Holloway and Pierce like gasoline into dry grass. I sat back, staring at the lines of code, the proof laid bare in the glow of the monitors. The realization settled in, with a strange calm. She wasn't just ambitious. She wasn't just arrogant. She was a weapon, one pointed straight at the heart of the company I built, at the deals that had taken me half my life to weave together. A child CEO backed by predators who knew exactly which strings to pull. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the weight of it press down. They hadn't fired me because I was obsolete. They had fired me because I was in the way. Too experienced, too informed, too dangerous to let stand. They thought removing me would be a clean cut. But what they'd really done was sharpen the blade. I leaned forward again, fingers gliding over the keys, pulling up dormant protocols I never thought I'd touch again. Emergency files, contact points, pressure valves, hidden across markets like charges waiting for detonation. Each one could topple a division, crash a stock, fracture a supply line. Together, they were a silent arsenal, my ledger, my shadow inheritance. The timer box blinked on the lower corner of the screen as I keyed in the first sequence. I set the clock not to hours, not to minutes, but to days. 5 of them. Enough to prepare, enough to watch the panic spread before the collapse. I sat back in my chair, the hum of servers filling the room like a storm building on the horizon. If they want a war, I whispered into the stillness, I'll give them one. But I won't start in the boardroom. I looked at the code, the countdown already ticking down, the silent bombs primed in digital veins. I'll start in their bloodstreams. The first cut was almost invisible. That was the beauty of it. A line of code, a phone call placed through an encrypted channel, a transfer order rerouted before it reached its destination. To anyone looking at the balance sheets, nothing seemed amiss. But behind the curtain, arteries were tightening, blood flow restricted. Contracts that had taken years to cultivate vanished in silence, their automatic renewals canceled by hands they couldn't trace. Offshore pipelines froze. A distribution channel in Singapore suddenly found its credit line revoked. A supplier in Brazil was flagged for irregularities that I fed into the right inboxes. Each action was small, almost surgical. Together they formed a slow suffocation. I sat in the loft, the glow of the screens painting my face in shades of cold blue. My hands moved with calm precision, not rushed, not reckless. Patience was the lesson my career had taught me. In boardrooms, as in battlefields, it wasn't the loudest man who won. It was the one who waited for his enemy to step into the trap. I had been waiting my entire life for moments like this, though I never expected to aim my blade at the company I had built with my blood. On the largest monitor, a live stream flickered. The new CEO stood under the stage lights of a converted warehouse, her voice amplified over music and applause. Halloway & Pierce was unveiling a new product line, some flash-in-the-pan, disruptive tech, meant to seduce investors with sleek designs and hollow promises. She wore a white suit that glowed under the LEDs, her youth packaged as the company's future. She laughed, she gestured, she charmed the crowd like a magician pulling endless scarves from her sleeve. But while she smiled, I watched the numbers behind her begin to fracture. A billion-dollar contract with a South African mining firm, canceled, effective immediately. A line of credit in Zurich, frozen under new compliance checks I triggered through an old ally in the banking sector. An entire shipment chain rerouted to customs for a random inspection that would take weeks, maybe months, to clear. Each move registered on my screens like detonations, red alerts cascading down the monitors. She had no idea. That was the part that both satisfied me and gnawed at me. She believed she was untouchable, basking in applause, while the ground beneath her heels was already giving way. Investors cheered her name. The press called her a visionary. And I knew, with the certainty of a surgeon holding a scalpel, that by the time they realized what was happening, her empire would already be ashes. Still, I didn't finish it. Not yet. I could have pulled the final trigger with a keystroke, collapsed entire subsidiaries, zeroed out credit, triggered clauses that would have sent stock plummeting. But I held back, the way a sniper holds his breath, even when the crosshairs are perfect. Not because I doubted, but because I wanted her to feel the fall, to hear the applause one night and the silence the next. As the crowd roared on the live stream, I leaned back in my chair. My reflection stared at me from the dark edge of the monitor. The lines in my face were deeper than I remembered, my hair thinner at the temples. I thought about what I had given to this company, the 20-hour flights, the dinners eaten out of plastic containers while I closed billion-dollar deals in hotel rooms, the wife who stopped waiting for me to come home, the daughter who grew up with a stranger in the house, who paid the bills, but never learned her favorite color. All of it sacrificed to build the machine that now spat me out as obsolete. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was proof. Proof that I had been the backbone, the architect, the hidden ledger that made the walls stand. Without me, it would collapse. And collapse it would. Under her watch, under her arrogance, under the weight of her ignorance. A notification pinged softly on the corner of the screen. I pulled it up, expecting another contract termination confirmation. What I saw instead froze me. An encrypted file packet, intercepted from one of her so-called venture partners. It contained client data, classified accounts, private records, information so sensitive, entire governments had trusted us to protect it. Sold, not leaked, not stolen. Sold in bulk to a rival firm operating under a foreign flag. I scrolled through line after line of proof, my jaw tightening with each revelation. This wasn't just corporate betrayal. It was treason against the very foundation of what Holloway and Pierce had been built to protect. For 19 years, I carried the weight of those secrets. I guarded them, traded them, leveraged them, but I never sold them. I knew the difference between power and betrayal. She didn't. I closed the file slowly, my reflection still staring back from the screen. My voice came low, steady, almost calm, though my hands clenched into fists against the desk. She didn't just steal my seat, I whispered. She sold the company's soul. The first story hit the wire on a Wednesday morning, a leaked internal memo, harmless on the surface, nothing more than a compliance note buried in jargon. But to the right journalist, with the right framing, it became a crack in the glass. I knew exactly which reporter to send it to. He'd been waiting years for a chance to cut Holloway and Pierce down to size, and I gave him the blade. Within hours, the article spread across financial feeds, whispers of accounting irregularities, rumors of shadow investors, quiet questions about whether the board had vetted the new leadership. Markets don't wait for proof. They smell smoke. They stampede. I didn't stop there. While the news churned, I fed documents to an old contact in Washington. Buried email chains, deliberately vague enough to raise suspicion, but damning when connected to the cartel funding I'd already traced. Regulators don't need full evidence to move. They need headlines, momentum, and a nudge in the right direction. By Thursday afternoon, inquiries were already being drafted. Friday, subpoenas. The fire spread faster than I anticipated, but that was fine. I wanted it to burn. From the loft, I watched it all unfold on my wall of screens. Stock prices dipped, then plunged. Investors who had once worshipped the young CEO now called emergency meetings behind closed doors, their confidence evaporating with each percentage point lost. Board members scrambled in glass offices high above the city, their faces pale under fluorescent lights, voices raised behind doors that couldn't hide panic. They wanted answers, but answers never come fast enough when the floor is giving way beneath your feet. And still, she fought. On the live broadcasts, she stood tall, her voice sharp, her posture perfect. She accused me directly, though she never used my name. Disgruntled former executives, she called us, painting herself as the victim of sabotage, the brave young leader under siege from bitter relics of the past. The arrogance in her eyes was unmistakable. Instead of softening the firestorm, she poured gasoline on it, daring me to reveal myself. She thought she was clever, cornering me publicly while her lawyers prepared injunctions to freeze what they believed were my assets. I let her. Every word she spoke, every lawsuit drafted in her name, every accusation that dripped from her lips only wove the noose tighter. She thought she was protecting her empire. In reality, she was exposing her network, laying out every connection, every ally, every secret thread she relied on to stay upright. I didn't need to rush. I watched, patient, calm, like a sniper waiting for the perfect breath. The kill box was forming, and she was walking into it willingly. Behind her staged defiance, the cracks widened. Investors bailed out, pulling funds before the stock collapsed completely. Clients called in contracts, demanding guarantees she couldn't provide. Employees began whispering to journalists, spurred by anonymous tips I placed through encrypted channels. Whistleblowers don't appear out of nowhere. They need guidance, safety, direction. I gave them all three, and they repaid me by spilling her secrets on record. Each voice was another blade against her, each revelation another fracture in the image she clung to so desperately. By the end of the week, Holloway and Pierce was on the front page of every financial paper, no longer the titan of stability, but the cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. And yet, she smiled. She strutted on stages, spoke to cameras, declared that everything was under control. Watching her cling to the illusion was almost admirable. Almost. But I knew illusions only last until the lights change. Late Friday night, a notification blinked across my screen. The board had scheduled an emergency session. The wording was clinical, stripped of drama, but I knew exactly what it meant. They were gathering to decide whether she would remain their savior or become their scapegoat. She would walk into that room believing she could salvage her throne, that her performance, her youth, her audacity would shield her. She believed she could cement her power once and for all. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of the servers fill the silence around me. The city outside was restless, headlights cutting through the dark like nervous glances. I thought about the 19 years I'd given, about the scars and the sacrifices, about the way she had dismissed it all with a single line. Tomorrow, she would learn what 19 years of leverage looked like when sharpened into a weapon. I whispered into the empty loft, steady, deliberate, every word a promise carved into stone. Tomorrow, sweetheart. Let's make it messy. The boardroom was colder than I remembered, though maybe it was just the silence that clung to the walls. The emergency session had been called for dawn, a time chosen to cut distractions, to force clarity. The directors sat in their polished leather chairs, faces pale, eyes tight, the weight of the stock collapse heavy on their shoulders. At the far end of the table, the seat at the head remained empty, waiting for the woman who believed she owned it. I sat near the middle, a ghost among them, the man they thought discarded. My hands rested on a slim black folder. Nothing about me drew attention, but the weight of what I carried was enough to end empires. The glass doors opened, and she swept in like a conqueror. White suit again, hair perfectly pinned, confidence dripping from every step. Even with the stock price bleeding, she smiled. That was her armor, arrogance polished to brilliance. She didn't glance at me, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I was already dead in her mind. She laid her tablet on the table, straightened her jacket, and launched into her speech as though the cameras were rolling. "Let's not waste time," she began, her voice firm, rehearsed. "We are under attack. Sabotage. A disgruntled former employee has spread lies, fed stolen data to the press, and manufactured a narrative of corruption. I will be pursuing legal action personally, but in the meantime, we must project strength. Investors respond to confidence, not weakness. We cannot let a bitter man dictate the future of this company." Her gaze finally landed on me, sharp as broken glass. "Isn't that right, Martin?" I smiled faintly but said nothing. Words weren't my weapon today. The directors shifted uncomfortably. They were torn between her fire and the undeniable collapse they could not explain away. She mistook their silence for loyalty and pressed forward, talking about innovation, resilience, youth. The same hollow song she had sung since the day she slid my termination papers across the table. When her voice finally paused, I opened the folder. No theatrics, no speeches, just one page laid flat on the polished wood. Wire transfers, tens of millions, traced from company accounts to offshore shells, then to names tied to the Valdez syndicate. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she regained her poise. "Fabrications," she said sharply. "Doctored documents." He's desperate. I slid the second page forward. Emails, her signature approving contracts with firms known for laundering. Messages to her so-called venture partners, discussing arrangements and deliverables in language that only a fool would mistake as innocent. The directors leaned closer, their faces draining of color as they read. She tried to speak again, but I was already placing the third piece on the table. Audio transcripts. Her voice, captured clean, discussing payouts, confirming shipments that were never reported, laughing about how easy it had been to sell off client data to rivals. Her face tightened, jaw clenching, as the board members stared at her with something far worse than suspicion. Betrayal. The room broke into chaos. Voices rose, directors demanding answers, some shouting for security, others already reaching for their phones. Investors on the other end of live calls began withdrawing funds in real time. I watched numbers collapse across the ticker feeds, running silently in the corner of the room. The regulators, already circling from the leaks I had set in motion, now had fuel to storm the gates. She slammed her hands on the table. "This is sabotage. You're letting him dictate the narrative. I built this future." Her voice cracked on the last word, the first fracture in her perfect facade. "No," one of the senior directors said coldly. "He built it. You sold it." Security arrived minutes later. They didn't look at me, didn't ask questions. Their orders were clear. She struggled, shouting threats, spitting promises of lawsuits and countersuits, her arrogance bleeding into desperation. But the gavel had already fallen, and everyone in that room knew it. By the time they dragged her through the glass doors, her career, her freedom, her future, all of it, was ash in the wind. Silence filled the room after she was gone. Not victory, not celebration, just silence. The kind that follows a storm when you realize the world has shifted and nothing will return to the way it was. I gathered my folder, closed it neatly, and stood. No applause followed me. None was needed. Outside, the daylight cut across the city like a blade, harsh and unforgiving. I breathed it in anyway. Betrayal isn't unique to boardrooms. It's in marriages, friendships, alliances. The faces change, the weapons change, but the pattern never does. Trust is a currency, and the moment it's devalued, the world burns. That's why revenge stories never end. They just change names. I walked down the steps, blending into the crowd, as the sirens began to wail in the distance. And tomorrow, there will be another name.